You're listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast, brought to you in partnership with the New Zealand dairy exporter. Join us as we talk to CRV experts, industry leaders and farmers about hot topics and issues affecting herd improvement in New Zealand's dairy industry today.
Last year we spoke to NZAEL manager Brian Wickham about the new genetic evaluation system for dairy cattle and what those changes mean for farmers. Today Brian joins us again to give us an update on progress and what dairy farmers can expect from NZAEL over the coming months. Welcome back, Brian.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
There have been a number of developments over the past year since we spoke about the release of NZAEL 2.0 model. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the work you and your team have been doing since then?
Just to remind ourselves of NZAEL 2.0, distinctly different from NZAEL 1.0. And the big change for 2.0 was that we shifted away from software that we use to calculate the evaluations to the latest version of the software. So that was the big part of that change that we talked about last time. Since then, we're focused on 3.0, surprise, and 3.0 has got a couple of pieces to it. The first bit is we're going to shift to totally different software and independent software. So this is a software system that's being provided by a company called the Helical Company, which is a New Zealand company, and they have taken over from a company called Theta Solutions LLC, which was an American company. The principals in the company are a father and son, Dorian and Daniel Garrick. So most people, a lot of people will know of the Garricks, and they're famous for quite a few good reasons. So that's the first point, is shifting this to this independent software.
And bringing it back to New Zealand by the sounds of it.
Well, the software that we were using in the past was the LIC software. So we're shifting off LICs onto this independent. And the Garricks, yes, they've spent a number of years in the US, but they are New Zealanders, and they're now back here a number of years as well, and have developed these tools for genetic evaluations, which are being used in a number of species in a number of countries. This is, in my view, the absolute leading edge of genetic evaluation systems, and that's part of the reason we're going to it. The other part of the reason is we just want to be able to assure everybody that we have an independent approach to genetic evaluations. And we think that's quite important. The second part is the incorporation of genomic data into these new evaluations. We've decided we're going to call that 3.5, just to make the distinction, because we expect that to take a bit longer than we'd thought. And I'll talk a little bit about why that might be in a moment or two. So there's those two bits. But when we shift to this new software, the first bit, we are planning to make some changes to some of the traits in terms of the models we use and the data we use, and we think that's going to be something that farmers are going to welcome.
I understand you've developed a new model for the fertility index. What's different about that, and when can the farmers expect this new model to be implemented?
And fertility is, I think, for most farmers in New Zealand, one of the most important traits that they would like to see improvements in. Historically, the trend hasn't been particularly favourable. It looks pretty flat when you look at progress over the last good number of years. And that's something we want to do something about. And to do something about it, we need two things. We need to have evaluations that actually identify them more fertile animals. And then, of course, that needs to result in different bulls being picked to sire the replacements. The new fertility evaluation uses more data. So it is using data on first calving cows when they calve for the first time. So in other words, the heifer calving, as we call it, and for later lactations, second, third, and fourth lactation, whereas currently we're only really using the data on the second calving of cows. So there's a lot more data getting used. And we think we've got better models. We're quite well advanced with this new fertility evaluation, and the testing that we've done shows that it is substantially better than the 2.0 evaluation for fertility. And the evidence is quite strong. We've done our internal sort of validation tests that we do, but we've also submitted the evaluations to the Interval system. Now, Interval system is where all the countries in the world throw their data in together, and we sort of line ourselves up with each other. And the Interval test is also showing that this is a significant improvement. We're getting better alignment with other countries for these fertility traits. It is only a next step, and we've already identified that there are further things that we want to do with fertility. They won't be here for December 21, so these ones I'm talking about will be December 21 is our current plan. The others will follow on. But that's the nature of this work. We're always trying to make things better, and there's a lot of work to do every time you want to make a change and get an enhancement in place.
And I think fertility is certainly something that we hear a lot about out in the marketplace, and I think farmers will be really pleased to hear that that's becoming a bit of a priority and more of a focus within the evaluation model. So what other traits are being reviewed?
There's two other sets of traits that we're looking at. One is the survival trait, and we're working on it as something we call functional survival. And we've got a prototype running, and we do expect some change from the current survival, which is something we call residual survival. We think we've got a better approach to that now. And the validation work's going on as we speak, and I don't have the results of that to share with you yet, but hopefully that won't be too far in the future. The other traits we're looking at are the calving traits, so it's gestation length and calving difficulty. And the focus there is to try and use more data than we currently do, because currently it's limited, and to use data on calvings from beef bulls and dairy cows. We don't have a lot of data, and which is sort of shocks me in a way that we don't have a lot more, because there are, I think, about 1 million cows mated to beef bulls and dairy cows in New Zealand, so we should be swamped in data, and that's something we're going to have to address. But we want to get the model working and identify all the problems, and then we'll talk about it. But I know for a lot of dairy farmers, the calf to the beef bull doesn't get very well recorded. Some people record the calving of the cow and ignore the calf altogether. That means it's a bit harder for us to do the evaluation on this calving ease type or the calving difficulty type trait. Gestation lengths, in a way, pretty easy, highly heritable, and it's not so hard to measure.
I think it's quite exciting actually to hear you talk about the data being gathered from the dairy beef side of the industry, because I think that is certainly an opportunity to be explored. There's certainly a lot more opportunity when you start talking about reducing bobbies and every calf having a purpose. And I think the more information we can gather on that stuff means that we can make informed decisions on our breeding program.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll talk about it again a little bit later, because we're going to talk about DIGAT and things like that. There's a lot of data out there that we don't see. And, farmers obviously do assist some calvings or notice some difficult calvings. Not all of those get recorded, and if they don't get recorded, not much we can do in terms of using the information. So I think we're going to be pushing for encouraging better recording, more extensive recording. And the message I want to get through to farmers is, look, you supply the data, we're going to try and make good use of it and give you some useful information back again.
Yeah, and that's so important. And I think understanding the impact of capturing that data is where the value will come from it. So there was supposed to be an economic value update, I believe, in February, but that seems to have been delayed. What are the plans moving forward? Do you expect this work to be completed, and by when?
So when we spoke a year ago, I think, as I recall at that time, we're in the middle of coping with the unexpected consequences of making changes in February. And one of the unexpected consequences is that we weren't lined up with the rest of the world when we do our evaluations. So we had to put in place some stopgap measures for 2 or 3 months while we caught up with the rest of the world, or the rest of the world caught up with us. I mean, the net result was that it cost us resource and money because we weren't aligned with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world does evaluations through this interval that I mentioned earlier, a couple of times a year, April and December. And so what we decided to do is that we would make any significant change in either April or December, and for New Zealand, December is far more suitable than April, because by then in April the breeding decisions are getting made, the semen's been sold but hasn't been put in a cow. And the last thing we want is to have any re-ranking going on while the semen is in the bank and not in the cow. So December works much better, aligns with the rest of the world, gets rid of this idea of stopgap solutions. There had to be a year when we were going to delay something. This was the year we did that delay. We did do some thinking about whether we should do a bit of an update of the economic values in February this year. We had a look at it, and as far as we could see, it wasn't going to change much in any case if we had, whereas what we're planning to do in December this year, there will be some significant changes. And, I've talked about the traits that are going to change, fertility, probably survival, possibly the calving traits, and that will result in new economic values and significant change.
So you mentioned DIGAD. Now, we've talked about DIGAD and the project around that in the past for the benefit of our listeners. So DIGAD is the Dairy Industry Good Animal Database. That's correct, isn't it, Brian?
Correct, yes.
Excellent. And this project is around transitioning the operation and maintenance of New Zealand's dairy cattle animal evaluation system from LIC to NZAEL. So effectively moving where the farmer's data is held and moving that to NZAEL. NZAEL, of course, is being a wholly owned subsidiary of Dairy NZ. So, Brian, can you give us a quick update on where this project's at?
This project, which we've named DIGAD 3.4, but really that means the 3 was a reference to the breed societies becoming supported through DIGAD rather than through LIC systems, and CRV as a herd record service provider being able to provide data directly to DIGAD. Up until November of last year, it was always indirectly via LIC. So we are developing DIGAD, Dairy Industry Good Animal Database, so that it sits and facilitates service providers rather than having one master service provider and all the others having to come through them. The CRV data feed is now operating, so data is coming directly to DIGAD. The feed to LIC hasn't totally stopped because we're in a transition period, which is always painful when you're doing these computer systems. And another element of it is that it will facilitate a herd owner that wishes to change service provider.
And I suppose a key part of that DIGAD project is looking at the quality of data, because as systems become automated, therefore you lose that person, that human element, and the ability to potentially have errors. So why is that so important? What are you really trying to achieve with this automation of the independent database, and why is it so important to New Zealand?
So the quality data, and you're going to hear me talk about this a lot more in the future, the DIGAD project, which is the one I'm just talking about, will be pretty much wrapped up in the next few weeks. And we have a new project we're starting up, Quality Data. And the whole thrust of that is to make sure that all of the data we use in genetic evaluations is absolutely of the highest quality. And quality, for me, it's about 3 things. One is completeness, and that is, if we're in a herd recording inseminations, have we got all the inseminations recorded, or have we just got the one that allegedly resulted in the calf being born? It's about timeliness. When do we find out that the cow was inseminated? Is it the day of the insemination, or is it the day the resulting calf was born? And they obviously have big implications for the trust you place in the data.
And which bull it was inseminated in the end too, right?
Exactly. And the final one is this sort of departures from normality. And that's a bit hard to sort of be precise about, but essentially, and we've seen this with the evaluations where some animals have changed dramatically, and one of them was a cow that was weighing, I think, 800 kilos, according to the scale weights we received, and according to the TOP inspection, it was 450 kilos or something. And that's just a data quality issue. And we really want to be able to track it right back to the source. And if farmers are providing us with data that it is not good quality, we need those farmers to know that. And we want to help them through their service providers take the steps that are necessary to get good quality data. Because if you don't have good quality data, you can't have good genetic evaluations, you won't make good decisions, your staff will be uninformed or not very well informed. So it's a really fundamental part of the whole industry.
And quality in, quality out. So you talked about that range of data that's actually out there that's kind of untapped within the industry. And I understand you're working with some of the dairy cattle breed societies on a new database to record and collate some of that vital data. And that's on a range of important traits of dairy cows. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
This is the so-called breed society solution. The breed societies for the last 35, 40 years have been using the LIC database for their herd book activities and for the traits other than production recording service they provide to the industry. So that's all shifting as we speak onto being supported by DIGAD. It's well advanced, and this last spring, that was the TOP, all the traits other than production, was about 50,000 animals that are inspected through that. It was through this new system, new handhelds. So that's all up and going. And right now we're switching the pedigree registration herd book activities over. It's, I think, a really important development for the breed societies and their activities. And it means that if a farmer chooses to change herd record service provider, it's not going to have an impact on their pedigree registration activities. And this is the importance, I think, of an independent national database like DIGAD. It lets farmers make service provision choices and have more freedom to exercise their judgment as to who is the best service provider.
I'm just interested to talk a bit more about that. So that's the traits other than production traits that we talk about, so the TOPs. So that's bringing that information, which some would say is more of a subjective type information, but bringing it into one database. Is that correct?
From here on, it'll be through the DIGAD structure. We'll use that information in the evaluations. The results will be available back through the service providers. There's no change in the information that's available to the herd owner, but we're trying to get just a little bit more independence and a freer flow of data between competing service providers.
And being able to analyse all that data together as well, and being able to understand the impact on the other traits potentially too.
Yeah, one of the real challenges, I think, in an industry like ours is we want to keep it easy for the farmer. And at the same time, we want to encourage the sort of innovation that comes from a bit of competition. And they're not necessarily totally compatible, because there is a temptation for the competing organisations to sort of lock all the data up and make it pretty difficult if somebody wants to change service provider. And, you've seen that in other industries in this country as to how that has to be opened up in a way that's good for the consumer and facilitates the competition and innovation and all the things that come from that.
And that's quite unique to New Zealand, isn't it? Because I understand overseas there's a far more open sort of sharing of data overseas, isn't there?
It depends on what country you go to. But you're right. Generally, in this genetic evaluation space, which is kind of where we focus in New Zealand Animal Evaluation Limited, that's the NZAEL, there are organisations like ours in most other countries, and they are providing most of the genetic evaluations in the rest of the world. So New Zealand's a little bit unique, with one major service provider being in that space, and we have multiple evaluations, which is also a source of confusion now and for the future if we don't get it sorted out.
And I understand you've also undertaken a review of the National Breeding Objective this year. And so as part of this review, you gathered stakeholder opinions at the end of last year through a survey, which I'm happy to say that I completed. And you obviously are going to share these results with stakeholders. And so how is this feedback being used, and what has happened since then?
So you're right, we haven't finished this review of the National Breeding Objective. The review is as much as anything about the process that we follow on a sort of an annual cycle to update the emphasis that is in the BW for each trait. So how much emphasis should you put on each trait? The approach that we've taken in the survey was just part of what we would probably call the knowledgeable stakeholders, and we got a very good response, very encouraging feedback. We're planning to do another survey, but this time we're going to target farmers, absolutely focus in on farmers, using It's a choice type questions. What would you prefer? A cow with a bad udder or an extra 10 kilos of milk protein? And that's been used quite widely in a number of other countries. And the people that do these surveys, Abacus Bio, have done these surveys in other countries. So we're planning to do that here for the first time. What we're thinking is that we want the BW to be forward-looking. It is somewhat mechanical and it is somewhat historically based, so it only uses data from the past. And it's my opinion that that doesn't do justice to the power of cattle breeding, that we should really be thinking more about the cattle we need for the future and be focused on breeding them. So you might, for example, give emphasis to udder traits, which currently don't contribute to the BW. The survey you referenced, that was one of the feedbacks was, look, you guys don't give enough notice to these traits. So that's why we want to actually talk to farmers and see whether that is what they would like us to do as well. And the other part of it is the environmental and welfare traits. Traditionally, if you take a hard economics approach, it's pretty hard for them to get onto the list. But again, we're looking to the future, and the signals we're getting about the future say, you guys, we'd better be doing something about this. And I can remember, in the past, I go back quite a long way to when protein was something you fed to the pigs, and the only stuff you delivered to the factory was fat. And, it was quite a long, involved process to even get protein into the BW equivalent at that time. I think that's what we're saying. Is the NBO, this review of the NBO really is about turning it into something that's going to breed the sort of cattle that farmers will need in the future.
And that's such a tricky balance, isn't it? Because genetics is a long-term game, but this industry changes so quickly and has been showing that in the last 5 years or so. And so it's that balance between quantitative and qualitative data, I think, the hard evidence versus what do we think is going to happen.
Fertility is the trait that my experience, reference here some work I did in Ireland over a few years, where the message from farmers was, I don't care what you economists say, I want animals that can calve. Even with the index that we had at the time, which was pretty radical in terms of how much emphasis it placed on fertility, farmers were still placing more emphasis on fertility. If the bull was negative fertility, he would not sell. That has resulted in a turnaround in fertility in those populations that have gone to that extreme. I wouldn't rule out the emphasis in New Zealand moving in that direction, especially if we can gain confidence in the accuracy of the evaluations for these fertility traits. Breeding can do lots of things, and it can do lots of things for those traits if that's really important. But we have to be very careful with breeding that we don't go chasing all sorts of things and lose the big prize, which is animals that are more efficient at converting the feed available on the farm into incomes for farmers.
Yeah, and I think you referred to it in our podcast all those months ago last year about staying true to kind of what you're already doing on farm and potentially just adapting to the sort of influences that come at you. And often when you sit back, look at the data, you may find that you're already doing a lot of that work. Yeah,
and that's a good point. I've been in this business for a little while. Every year there's some new thing that everybody's saying we should race off and chase that. But that's not how breeding works. It is long, slow, steady progress. And the lesson, and this is just a lesson from my Irish experience, when I first went to Ireland in 1998, there was some research that established that the high index animals were less profitable than the low index animals, right? Exactly the wrong way around. And that was, I think, a real lesson for me, that if you get breeding wrong, you actually can lose profitability. And if you get it right, it is spectacular what it can do. Now, I think New Zealand has been pretty well served with its cattle breeding to this point, but you can never rest on your laurels in this business and must always be focused on what it is really needed in the long term. And it is long term, 5 to 15 years. So many people who are going to be milking in 5 or 20 years' time are not farming at the moment. So we're breeding cattle for other people in many ways.
Oh, look, and I think no matter what industry you're in, quality data is critical to business success. Understanding where the gaps might be and where opportunities for growth exist, they're an important part of continuous improvement, and I think that's what we've really been talking about today. The DIGAD project, that's an exciting step forward for New Zealand dairy industry. CRV is proud to be actively involved, and things like the automatic transfer of data, I'm sure that's something we'll all be relieved to see. I know internally for our business and also for farmers, making sure that everything runs smoothly. And I think continuous review of the evaluation models, that's fantastic. The quality of the data that contributes to those is a given, has to be. And we see that this will directly benefit farmers by improving those genetic offerings from those New Zealand breeding companies. And of course, you need to know what direction to head in. And I think this is where the national breeding objectives, they really come to the fore. It's fantastic to see that we've been able to have our say, and we look forward to hearing more about that and what the farmers have to say.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you today for joining us, Brian, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Thanks for listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast. Read more about today's topic and our panel guests by visiting crv4all.co.nz. That's crv4all.co.nz. Or follow us on social media.